The Lost Mind, the Fallen Empire. Night had closed over the city, like a glass coffin lid. In the upper floors of the high-rises, office lights were going out one by one, leaving only a few stubborn windows glowing with pale light. Davin's office was one of those lights. On the 32nd floor, the corner office was wrapped in glass walls. The dim yellow interior light collided with the cold blue outside and split him into two colors. Scattered reports on his desk shivered slightly in the air from the AC, and on his computer screen, a single sentence cast a shadow over almost every document on the table. Bankruptcy filing approved. Davin was slumped back in his chair, his spine pressed deep into the hard leather, breathing as if an invisible weight were sitting on his chest. His jacket had long since been abandoned on the back of the chair, his tie loosened, and that dirty gray ring of end-of-day fatigue had formed on the collar of his once crisp white shirt. The smart ring on his finger buzzed with a weak notification, then fell silent. There was nothing left that required notifications anymore. Far below, the city's streetlights stretched into pale lines. Once, this height had felt like the perspective he deserved. He'd look down at traffic, at people walking, at other buildings, and savor the sharp satisfaction of seeing everything from above. Now the view beyond the glass looked like a silent image of a world drowned underwater, distant, mute, meaningless. On the corner of his desk sat a small prototype device gathering dust. Its edges were scratched, and on the surface a logo was almost worn away, NovaCore V1.0. The dim light that hit the matte casing swallowed most of the letters, leaving only two clearly visible. Go. George's first idea, his first prototype, marked with that simple, hastily chosen font. Davin reached out and turned the device over, brushing it with his fingertips like someone feeling a possibility that had slipped through his hands years ago. He didn't say the name out loud, but in his head a word repeated like an unwanted echo that refused to fade. George. This bankruptcy hadn't happened in a single day. It was the accumulated result of skipped sentences, swallowed anger, and dismissed intelligence. As the clouds over the city thickened and darkened that night, scenes from Davin's past swelled inside his memory, rising like a storm. Earlier, the same office had looked much brighter. When the midday sun struck the glass, the metal pen holder on the desk, the computer tower, even the hard edges of his chair reflected light in small, dazzling flashes. On one of those days, the door clicked softly and a tall, slim man stepped inside. George always knocked like that, barely, entering as if he were slipping in alongside the air. His suit never fit quite right. The jacket was always a size too large, his tie always tilted a few millimeters off center. But his eyes made you forget the lack of polish in everything else, sharp, focused, and unnervingly intense when he was looking at screens, scanning code, or explaining system diagrams. Behind those eyes lived a world he never fully verbalized. When he walked in this time, he carried a tablet with a thicket of graphs glowing on the screen. Davin was in the middle of a video call with an investor, reciting the story of the company's growth curve, expanding market share, and his visionary leadership. His phrases were razor-sharp, his cadence measured, his smile rehearsed. George stopped at the threshold and waited for a moment, then chose to stand in a corner rather than approach the desk. He never stepped closer without a direct invitation. That distance was something he'd learned over the years. When Davin listened to George, he had developed the habit of looking not at the screen, but at George's face. He watched that fast, calculating gaze, trying to catch the hidden hardness in his tone. But each time, all he saw was the faint exhaustion and fractured resignation of someone who had gotten used to being ignored. Davin read that resignation as a clause in his favor. He doesn't argue. Even if he objects, he'll fall in line in the end. That day was no different. George laid out the danger of launching a new product without overhauling parts of the infrastructure and closing the security gaps. He reminded him of the launch date promised to investors. He mentioned warnings from a few major clients. Davin listened, but in his mind only one date kept spinning: launch day. Press, cameras, product demo, market valuation, headlines. He had personally named the product NovaCore. He'd hand-picked the slogans for the presentations. The nervous system of the future. Behind those glossy phrases were George's months of labor, the team's late nights, endless tests, code reviews, and checklists. But on the outside, only one signature shone on the front page: Davin's. When George finished and the room fell silent, Davin braced his elbows on the desk and laced his fingers together. He narrowed his eyes and exhaled through his nose. His expression looked thoughtful, but the decision had already been made. He knew the risk, but the pull of a win despite the risk had always been more intoxicating to him. George's voice rang one last time in the room, suggesting they postpone the launch date. That voice bounced off the walls, skimmed the ceiling, struck the glass, then sank into some unseen place. While Davin searched for a way to silence that echo, he ran a simpler calculation. If the product hit, all those warnings would be remembered as unnecessary pessimism. If it didn't, a scapegoat could always be found. There was always someone to blame. On launch day, even the skyscrapers seemed to stand a bit straighter, as if they too wanted a clear view of the show. The hotel ballroom was drenched in lights. A huge LED screen behind the stage pulsed with the NovaCore logo, bright lines, abstract circuit imagery, a stream of speeding data animations. When Davin stepped onto the stage, the spotlight wrapped him in a halo of white. His speech read like a carefully crafted story of triumphant leadership. Words like "our team," "our vision," and "innovation" appeared often, but the center of each sentence was still "I." George sat toward the back of the room at a dark table, tapping the rim of his water glass with his finger in a steady rhythm as he watched. The spotlight never touched him. The only light on him was the pale reflection bouncing off the stage, just enough to throw a faint metallic glint into his eyes. The launch video drew loud applause. Members of the press raised their phones to capture shots of the stage. During the first live demo, the system worked smoothly. First user signups opened, first batches of data were processed. The air inside the ballroom swelled with the thrill of a gamble on the verge of paying off. But George noticed small inconsistencies on the screen, millisecond stutters in the charts, the subtle glitches he'd seen hundreds of times in test environments. As the load on the servers climbed, the fans in the data center ramped up, processors heating degree by degree. George slipped out of the ballroom for a moment and pulled out his phone. The monitoring app was blinking in red in multiple places. Back on stage, Davin was in the middle of answering a reporter's question about future market share and international expansion. His tone still radiated confidence. No one in that room had any idea that in a windowless hall miles away, the cooling system in the data center had crossed a critical threshold, its overdue maintenance finally coming due. The first crash came like a small, recoverable bug. Users reported the app freezing. The system attempted to restart itself, but in the background, a chain reaction had already begun. One component overloaded, then shifted that burden onto another. Backup processes were triggered but failed to initialize. Memory leaks began pulling security protocols into the mess, causing them to lock down the system. Data started to tangle, some records corrupting, some disappearing, some being written into the wrong place. Within hours of the launch, what was initially phrased to the press as a minor technical issue had led to critical data corruption for 3 major enterprise clients. Some records could not be recovered. Trust in the market was far more fragile than money, and when it shattered, the sound was louder than any financial loss. In the days that followed, tension thickened in the company's glass-walled meeting rooms. Reports, angry emails, market reactions piled into one chaotic blur. On the giant displays, the company's stock value flowed downward like a slow-motion fall, a graph watching its own descent. With each meeting, Davin grew more agitated, the edges of his face hardening, the smooth negotiator's tone thinning into something sharper, more defensive. Through it all, George worked quietly. He directed the teams, analyzed failures, salvaged whatever data he could. While servers were being reconfigured at 2 in the morning, he was there, under the washed-out glow of the racks, dark crescents deepening under his eyes. A muted stubbornness seemed to anchor him to his chair. Maybe he still felt responsible, even in a disaster that proved every warning he ever given. Maybe he couldn't simply walk away from a structure he'd helped build. Davin left him alone for a long time. Then one morning, before the sun had fully climbed over the shorter buildings, he called George into his office. The glass was slightly fogged, making the street below look like a frozen photograph. When George walked in, there was a single folder on the desk. Inside were reports, analyses, printed emails, and on the front page a jarring heading: System Architect, George L. Haynes, prior risk warnings, analyses, signature dates. Page after page of documents George had written, signed, and sent over the years. Davin had read them all. Yet the expression on his face resembled that of a judge preparing to pass sentence, not someone seeking to understand. From the outside, their conversation might have looked civil. Inside, each line carried accusations stuffed beneath measured language, anger bent into polite shapes. Davin was getting ready to point to the responsible technical owner of this meltdown. In the eyes of the market, the board, and the investors, there needed to be one name, and that name belonged to the man standing on the other side of the desk. As George listened, his eyes drifted over the papers, titles, dates, the signatures at the bottom. He remembered the hope he'd carried each time he signed one of those documents. Maybe this time they'll take it seriously. Maybe this time they'll listen. Maybe this time they'll fix the foundation. None of that had happened. Now those same signatures were being wielded as evidence against him. They both knew the truth. Davin knew he couldn't shoulder this disaster alone. George knew this wasn't about a single bug or an unlucky crash, but years of deferred maintenance budgets, security updates pushed aside for later, decisions made to maximize speed and profit at the expense of resilience. But truth is a pliable thing, reshaped by power. The louder voice, the stronger chair, the more binding authority, those defined the official story. The decision written into that document was short, cold, and irreversible. George's contract was terminated due to gross technical negligence that damaged business continuity and corporate reputation. No severance, no references. In the official record, it would remain a single sentence beneath a long narrative he hadn't been allowed to write. When George left the building that day, he carried only a small cardboard box. Inside were a few notebooks, an old photograph, the label from the first server they'd ever set up together in a tiny startup space, and a small, slightly rusted metal piece he'd removed from one of the early prototypes, something that would never be used again. The chill of that metal seeped into his fingers as he walked. He paused on the sidewalk and looked up. The glass caught the morning light, revealing nothing of the lives behind it. He couldn't pick out which window belonged to the office where he'd just been dismissed. It didn't matter anymore. After a moment, he stopped looking. He started walking. Underneath it all, the anger, the fatigue that crept up to his wrists, the hollow ache in his chest, none of it had yet congealed into a plan. It was just a heavy silence, an unspoken acknowledgement that something had ended. Days began to blur into one another in the strange rhythm of unemployment. Mornings lacked a reason to get up. Nights and mornings slid together, the line between them dissolving. George sat at his computer trying to write new code, but every line stumbled under the weight of shadows from the old system. He scrolled job postings, drafted messages, sent applications. Each time he tried to describe his last position, his responsibilities, and why he'd left, he got stuck on how to code that truth into a few neat lines. One afternoon, a message arrived from an old acquaintance, a name he hadn't seen in years, Thomas Vale. Back when Davin's company was still small, Thomas had been running something even smaller, a firm barely big enough to be called a competitor. But over the years, through a slow and disciplined strategy, he'd built it into a mid-sized but solidly grounded player. The message was short. He said he'd heard what had happened, found it unfortunate, and if George was open to it, he'd like to meet for coffee and talk. It wasn't a blatant pitch. It was an invitation worded like a door left slightly ajar. Thomas had never been the type to rush the front gate. He preferred to watch people reach the edge on their own, and then have the ground ready underneath. They met at a modest cafe downtown. Exposed brick walls, the smell of coffee heavy in the air, narrow windows facing the street. When George sat down, the man across from him was wearing no tie, just a dark shirt and a simple jacket. Thomas's face had soft lines, but his eyes held the cool composure of someone who'd been doing mental math for a very long time. They started with small talk about old projects, changes in the market, shifts in the industry. Thomas had followed the launch crisis closely, analyzing not just the technical failure, but the market reaction. As George spoke, Thomas listened without interrupting, quietly translating the technical details into a different kind of diagram in his mind. His questions were pointed but gentle. George, for the first time in a long while, felt the strange relief of being heard without being cut off. Yet beneath that relief, a wary part of him stayed awake. Eventually, Thomas said what he'd wanted to say all along. After a collapse like this, he said, it would be hard for Davin's company to recover, especially from the loss of trust. He mentioned a project his own firm had been working on, a new platform that had potential but hadn't yet found the breakthrough force it needed. His team was good, he admitted, but for years he'd watched certain minds from afar and imagined what they could do together if circumstances changed. George wasn't surprised. In the weeks after the crash, a few companies had reached out, none with the measured care Thomas showed. And he quickly realized this wasn't the usual job opportunity. It was closer to a partnership. Not just a salaried role, but a position where he'd be the technical and architectural mind of something new. Contracts, equity, NDAs, all of that could be hashed out later. There was also something else on the table, invisible but very real, the possibility of revenge. Thomas knew the weak points in Davin's company. He'd seen the aggressive growth, the flashy news, the crafted media profile, the fragile relationships with investors. George knew the rest, the floor plan, the load-bearing beams, the hidden staircases, the hairline cracks in the walls. He knew exactly where to hit a building that looked solid from the outside so it would crumble with one well-placed blow. Neither of them said that out loud. Their fingers traced the rims of their coffee cups, their sentences carefully chosen. When Thomas said, "We need a new architecture," he wasn't just talking about his project. When George said, "I think things need to be a lot fairer from now on," he wasn't just referring to work conditions. When they left the table, there was no signed deal, but there was a clear understanding. In a few days, George would come to Thomas's office for a more formal meeting. That meeting would mark not only a new chapter, but also the reshaping of feelings they both thought belonged to the past. Compared to Davin's glass tower, Thomas's headquarters rose only a few stories off the ground. There were no giant screens or gleaming logos in the lobby, just a plain reception desk, a few plants, and quiet employees moving with a steady rhythm. As George stepped inside, he felt that this place had a slower but deeper pulse. Things moved differently here, less show, more structure. In the conference room, he sat down with Thomas and a few senior managers. On the table were detailed documents about Thomas's new project, architecture plans, market analyses, competitive landscape charts. George went through them page by page. Technically, it was ambitious, but in the right hands, it could become something powerful. Unlike Davin's product, this one was designed to be more flexible, more secure, more transparent. But the real edge lay in something beyond the code, the potential to become a system the market believed in. Thomas eventually turned the conversation to Davin's ongoing crisis, dropping the subject into the room like a news headline. He watched George's face closely. He didn't push, but beneath the words there was a clear implication. If we launch at the right time, in the right way, we don't just fill their gap, we can draw their disillusioned customers to us. George knew those customers. He knew their systems, expectations, habits. He had spent nights in their meeting rooms personally setting up servers, getting out of bed at 3 a.m. to save their data. Now those same clients were furious, disappointed, and mistrustful. The company's logo had turned into a stain in their eyes, but George's name might still carry a quiet association with reliability. By now, Thomas's offer was fully visible. George wouldn't merely design a new system. He'd also bring his experience from the old world, inviting people he once walked beside to step onto a new path. Technically, it was a strategic move. Ethically, the line was blurred. Some would call it betrayal. Others would call it justice. The ones watching from the outside would get to pick the word. Inside, it didn't feel so simple. George wrestled with the decision for nights. In his small apartment, under the dull light of a desk lamp, his head bowed, his hands hovering over the keyboard. He saw Davin's face, the client's expressions, the system collapsing on launch night, the morning he'd been fired. The careful composure in Thomas's eyes. Anger and a sense of violated fairness twined together like two strands of rope, impossible to separate cleanly. At last, sometime past midnight, he wrote the first lines of the new system. Into that code he poured years of experience, the patience from all those ignored warnings, and maybe most of all, the sum of all the times he'd postponed standing up for himself. Every line carried a shadow of his past work. Every line was also a step away from it. Over the following months, the new platform at Thomas's company took shape. George's architecture fused with the team's disciplined work. Security protocols were written with obsessive care, tests executed again and again, scenarios rerun until they became muscle memory. No risk was brushed off with a "we'll deal with it later." In budget meetings, George's voice suddenly had real weight. His warnings no longer disappeared between pages, no longer got lost in notebooks, no longer sat buried in the last slides of decks. Each concern became something that was evaluated, addressed, and converted into a change. Thomas moved cautiously in public. Development remained secret. Only a small set of select clients were given pilot access. Some of them had once been Davin's star accounts. In those first test sessions, George sat across from them, their faces showing both a familiar trust and a wary hesitation. But as the tests ran cleanly, as the system demonstrated its resilience, that hesitation began to melt. One day, under a sky thick with gray clouds, the board at Davin's company convened. The lobby was still impressive. Visitors were still greeted by old success videos looping on giant screens. But on the upper floors, the air was dense. Financial reports, lists of lost customers, canceled contracts, all lay piled in layers on the long table. One board member removed his thick glasses and set them down, rubbing his eyes with his fingers. The latest client they had lost had been one of their biggest sources of revenue. Word was spreading that they had gone to Thomas's firm. Trade press hadn't written it openly yet, but the industry was buzzing. A rumor was also circulating. The architect behind Thomas's new platform was their former chief architect, George. Davin's face stayed frozen throughout the meeting. A muscle in his jaw twitched from time to time. A deep line carved itself between his brows. The more the board questioned him, the shorter and more defensive his answers became. Some of them shot him looks that suggested more than they said, had he fired the one person he couldn't afford to lose. By the end of the meeting, they were talking rescue plans, new credit lines, asset sales, downsizing. All of it felt like footsteps on thinning ice, the surface cracking a bit more with each step. Across the street, the lower but more grounded facade of Thomas's building already bore a fresh, well-designed logo. Beneath it, in smaller letters, the name of the new platform. There were no giant billboards yet, but inside the motion had clearly intensified. People streamed in and out of conference rooms, carrying decks and laptops. The signs of a system being born were everywhere. Time turned Davin's company into a car hurtling downhill. Each curve sent it skidding harder. Each attempt to brake left deeper tire marks on the road. News of a bankruptcy rarely breaks in a single day. First come the rumors. Distributors grow cautious. Suppliers shorten payment terms. Employees quietly start browsing job sites. Then banks start calling. Lawyers appear more often. Finally, everything coalesces into one stack of papers and one word at the top. The day Davin signed those papers, he wasn't in his glass office, but in a much smaller, much colder conference room. His lawyer sat beside him, a court representative across the table, thick files between them. There were no windows, only the muffled sounds of the hallway seeping under the door. As he signed, he noticed his fingers shaking slightly. It wasn't the same tremor he'd felt years ago when signing his first major investment deal. Back then, his hand had held the excitement of stepping into the future. Now it felt like gripping the handle of a door that was closing on his fingers. Once his signature was down, the rules of the game changed. The company was no longer the shining success story it had once sold itself as. In legal terms, it had become the debtor. While he listened to the details of the process, his mind drifted back to older scenes. The first cheap, cracked window office, the 8-person team who truly believed they'd be the next big thing, the day George brought in the first prototype, the night they stayed up together building their first server. Back then, the word "we" meant something. Over the years, I had eaten it from the inside out. Once the bankruptcy became official, a quiet dismantling began in the office floors. Desks were cleared, files boxed up, servers powered down. Some employees left furious, some in tears, some walking with the calm of people who'd said their goodbyes in their heads long before. Nameplates were removed. The framed certificates came down. When the old logo on the wall was pried off, a paler rectangle of paint remained where the sun had never reached. Davin walked the hallways alone. Each door opened onto a room that had once been full and now smelled of dust. When he opened the server room, most of the racks were already stripped, the machinery taken away. But on a few shelves, some cases remained. Labels faded, cables cut. The fans no longer whirred. The LEDs stayed dark. The silence in this room felt heavier than anywhere else. He reached out and placed his hand on the rusting edge of one of the original server cases they'd installed together. He remembered that night, the way George's hands moved confidently around the cables while he asked how long until we went live, the way George hadn't complained once working until dawn, the way by morning both their eyes had been bloodshot but the system had been humming. He had actually said the words, "We did it," that day. When had he stopped saying, "We did it"? When had "we" quietly become "I did it"? His mind jumped to the morning he'd fired George. The papers on the desk, the termination letter, the polished but emotionally empty phrases that had come from his own mouth. Back then he'd convinced himself it was a tough but necessary decision for the company's protection, for reputation management. Looking back now, he saw what he'd really been protecting was his own ego. At the end of the corridor, he opened the door to the corner office. Once his, once a throne of glass with a view of the city's brightest lines, it was now half empty. A few stray documents lay on the desk. Beside them, that small device again, a Nova Core prototype. On its side, a fine scratch and a tiny marking, a small engineer's signature, something George had carved into it. Not a factory defect, a deliberate trace, a silent claim of authorship. Davin picked it up and rolled it in his hand. Once it had felt like a miniature model of the future they were building. Now it was more like a headstone for the company. He turned to the window. Across the street, the opposing building's glass reflected the sky. It stood lower, but its new, crisp logo glowed with fresh paint. Under it, the name of their new platform. There were no giant announcements yet, but the building pulsed with motion, people coming and going, carrying the energy of something just about to launch. Through one of the upper windows he spotted a silhouette in a conference room, a figure standing before a large screen. Distance blurred the face, but the posture, the line of the shoulders, the way the hands moved while explaining something, it looked like George, standing before a display, shaping an invisible architecture in the air with his gestures. Time slowed inside Davin in that moment. His breath snagged in his chest, his throat went dry. All the words, presentations, and deals he had built his identity on were suddenly overshadowed by a single realization. The man he should never have let go, his quiet, relentless architect, was now inside that other building, constructing a new structure in the shadow of the wreckage Davin had left behind. And he was doing it with more care, more fairness, more patience than he'd ever been granted. Rage surged through him, flooding his veins. Its first target was Thomas. It was easy to label him as opportunist, snake, the worst kind of competitor. Then the fury veered toward George, ungrateful, traitor, backstabber. He tried these words on in his head, repeating them as if he could shrink his own share of guilt by saying them enough times. But after a while, the words began to hollow out. The anger, denied a satisfying target, hit a kind of mirror and bounced back. Thomas was a competitor. Competitors capitalized on openings. That was their nature. George had been scapegoated, ignored, discarded. Was his move betrayal or a delayed escape? The more Davin tried to twist the story in his favor, the less credible his own narrative sounded. What remained was anger with nowhere to go, but still very much alive. Slowly it pivoted and turned inward, toward his own decisions, his blindness, his arrogance, toward the way he had treated George's warnings as obstacles, postponed maintenance as resource waste, dismissed him in his mind as a technician who just doesn't get the vision. The leadership moves he'd once been so proud of now appeared as the very blows that had cracked his own foundation. He stepped away from the window. Perched on the edge of the desk, he set the prototype down. His fingertips were still trembling. This tremor wasn't just about lost money, bankruptcy, or reputational collapse. It was also the tremor of losing something irretrievable, the possibility of a true we, a partnership he had chosen to end in the worst possible way. By the time the city lights flickered on again, Davin had to leave the building for good. There was no door he could unlock by right anymore. As he walked through the lobby, he remembered the first time he'd crossed that threshold. Proud, his steps quick, his mind full of bright sketches of the future. Now his steps were heavy, his shoulders slack. The security guard by the entrance gave a strained nod, some effort at politeness. Their relationship had never gone beyond employer-employee, yet there was a faint sadness in the man's eyes. When giants fall, people don't think about their own lives. They hear the sound of the impact. Outside, the air was cool. The night had not fully settled. A gray twilight hung over the city. Car headlights painted brief patches of light across the sidewalks, then stripped them away. Davin walked along the curb for a while, then, without quite meaning to, looked up at the building across the street. The lobby of Thomas's firm glowed with clean white light. Through the glass, he could see people stepping out of elevators, carrying coffee cups and laptop bags, moving quickly through the space. A banner had been hung above the entrance, a teaser for a big upcoming launch, a new product, a new era. He stopped and stared at the banner. Between the lines, he tried to pick out phrases that sounded like something George might have written. Trust, sustainability, transparency. Words he'd once used in his own pitches without ever really filling them with substance. Near the door, he saw a figure checking his phone. Even from a distance, the silhouette was unmistakable. George. A simple suit, likely some notes in his hand, a list of technical points, maybe meeting agendas. He looked up for a second, scanning the scene in front of the building. His gaze skimmed over the street, but never found Davin. There was both physical and invisible distance between them now. Two parallel lines in the same city, in the same industry, on the same street, never intersecting again. Davin felt sentences rising inside him, ones he knew he could never say out loud. Apologies, regrets, admissions like "you were right." But those words no longer had a place to land. Some things only mean something when spoken on time. Once they're delayed, they become nothing more than echoes inside a single person. He tore his gaze away from George and turned back toward his own building. Its logo was gone, leaving a blank facade. The wind threaded itself through the holes where the mounting bolts had been, creating a soft, low whistle. To his ears, it sounded almost like a murmur, as if the building, for the first and last time, were trying to tell its story, speaking in a language no one remembered anymore. He took a step back. A strange calm began to settle over him. It was the emptiness that follows acceptance of loss. The anger was still there, but it had finally found its direction. There was no one left to throw it at. Thomas was carving his own path. George had found a different ground to stand on. The board, the investors, the market, all of them would craft their own narratives from the ruins. Inside him, however, another narrative was being written. The story of a leader blinded by his own power, of loneliness creeping silently across an entire floor, of the cost of choosing not to listen, of an empire lost because he treated a brilliant mind as disposable. In this story, guilt couldn't be neatly pinned to a single word or a single person, but one sentence rose from the chaos with startling clarity. He was the one who had pushed George out the door. For years he had minimized his contributions, brushed off his warnings, reduced him to a component instead of walking beside him as an equal. The signature on the bankruptcy petition hadn't just closed a company, it had put a period at the end of a partnership, a trust, a we that might have survived if he'd chosen differently. Feeling the night wind cut across his face, Davin started to walk. With every step, the building behind him shrank. The lights of the opposite tower remained in the corner of his vision like a faint, persistent note, even when they slipped out of sight. He stopped when he reached a bridge further down the road. Below, traffic flowed in smeared ribbons of light, a blurry river of motion. Once, when he looked at this city, he'd felt like the person controlling the current. Now he leaned against the railing like someone who isn't sure where the stream will carry him. Inside him, the sharp sting of a late realization burned. All the times he had mistaken power for worth, loneliness for strength, silence for obedience, warnings for obstruction, loyalty for something he was perpetually owed, each of those moments replayed in his mind. The sum of those moments had carried him here, to this bridge, this night, as the former owner of a bankrupt company. The anger was still there, but he finally understood where it belonged. It wasn't for Thomas or for George, it was for himself. There had been no knife in his back, only the wall he'd built with his own hands, a wall that had eventually left him outside. The problem wasn't Thomas's cunning, it was his own failure to see the value standing right in front of him. Regret was the natural consequence of that clarity. Hot, suffocating, leaving no room to escape. He looked one last time at the skyline. In one building, the lights were going out. In another, they were turning on. One side was sinking into the closing shot of a tragedy. The other was preparing for an opening scene. In his own story, his role had changed. He had stepped out of the protagonist's place and into the figure people would point to later as a cautionary tale. Years from now, people in the industry would probably tell it as a short, almost neat anecdote. A CEO fires his brightest engineer. That engineer joins the competitor, and the CEO lives to watch his own company crumble. A simple sentence, easy to repeat. But that sentence wouldn't hold the weight of all the nights, the silences, the suppressed emotions, the many "I'm sorries" that never made it past his lips. Davin pushed away from the rail and started walking again. He didn't look back. Behind him, the city remained bright, alive, but for him, the lights had lost their meaning. He had learned his lesson, late, heavy, and at a cost that could not be recovered. And perhaps the cruelest part of it was this: there was no one to confess it to anymore. No audience for a grand theatrical admission. Some regrets echo only inside the person who carries them. That night, the echo of his regret rose quietly and blended into the silence hanging over the city. Thank you for listening. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next story.